So, does everybody have one of the handouts there at both sides? All right, so if you turn to the last page of that, that'll do some of my work for me. Let me mention, so I'm in the philosophy department. So I want to just kind of tee up the talk as a sort of prelude or overture, touching on a couple themes, but mostly explaining why I'm interested in these. So Scott's been in my class this whole past week, in my environmental philosophy class. We've been working on the book that he's going to be talking about. And so I want to touch on a little bit of why I was excited to have him come to my class, why I was really excited that this worked out, of having this lecture here, by touching on a couple tensions that you get in DWC and Humanities Forum with what he's going to be talking about. Right? So a few things to point out. A few tensions, let's call them. So first, right, all of you read something by Plato in DWC, right? So starting in the beginning of what we call Western philosophy, that was Socrates. But with Socrates, you get a turn away from nature, right? He's in the city. He explicitly says in one of his dialogues that he does a second sailing, and he turns to the things of culture, to the things of the human being, and kind of, in that sense, if you turn to one thing, you turn your back on the other. You also get this kind of tension between philosophy and poetry, famously in Plato's huge dialogue, The Republic, where he's creating an ideal republic. The poets are banished from there because they're liars, right? They don't tell the truth, right? You get, additionally, this tension in another humanities discipline, as we call it here in DWC, theology, right? So just think about some of the things that you read from the Bible. Think about these ideas of being in the world, but not of the world, right? This world is not your home. You're meant for something later. And this kept triggering me, this title of this book by Tim Lilburn, a Canadian poet who used to be a monk. The title of it is Living in the World as If It Were Home, right? The as if gets really stressed by him of how do you deal with that. And lastly, this tension just of the humanities in general, right? The building we're in is called the Rien Center for the Humanities. We study development of Western civilization. This is the Humanities Forum. But if you push most people to define nature, they'll define it by whatever's untouched by human beings, right? So if you want to study the humanities, right, you come to DWC, you study things made by humans, human culture. If you want to study nature, you tend to go to ALMAG and the sciences, right? So you get these, let's call them at minimal tensions. So me personally, right, I'm a philosopher, I'm in the philosophy department, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a poet, and yet I've always wanted and craved some kind of resolution to these tensions. And this is what got me so interested in Scott's work, right? So there's this wonderful quote from one of his poems where he's talking about the idea of bridges. So imagine a huge suspension bridge, right? These gigantic ones, they span a huge river, these huge cables, this massive amount of tension. And this is what he says about it. The suspension bridge proves nothing about human ingenuity, only that tension combs strength from chaos, right? The idea that when you get a tension or a kind of dichotomy, you don't pick one over the other. You don't pick the humanities or the sciences, philosophy or nature, philosophy or poetry, theology or nature, but how do you bring them into synthesis? So I bring these to connect it to me, hopefully connecting to you, but to kind of tee up Scott, that what's exciting to me about him is his work itself, but also that his work that he'll be talking about is sort of an offshoot of his life. As you see from the biography at the end, award-winning poet, memoirist, essayist, and translator. But for a lot of his life, he was early on an artist, but he spent a huge amount of his time as an activist, as an environmental activist, working for the Nature Conservancy and for other kinds of entrepreneurial endeavors, right? Not an academic, but striving to bring these things together on his own, right? The life that he lived, right, working in one career for 5 or 10 years and another one, is very dissimilar to an academic's life, but incredibly similar to the life that most of you as students will live. You'll be jumping around from thing to thing and reinventing yourself. And so part of what I like about his work and the way that it comes out is precisely the way that he dwells with these tensions and uses them to comb strength from chaos, right? Uniting poet and entrepreneur, or as we in the Dominican tradition would say, contemplation and action, right? Pulling on both senses of the term oikos, meaning home, and economy and ecology. But these for him become a sort of living together. And so he speaks to us from experience, right, phenomenologically, as he'll discuss, from the attempt to reconcile tensions and opposites, not merely theoretically, but practically, coming to understand lived experience as a matter of life and death. And so he's going to help us tonight come to dwelling with that lived experience of dwelling a bit more. And we couldn't ask for a better guide, Scott Edward Anderson.
I'm going to do this without the mask, just because it's going to be easier for you to hear me. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that introduction. It really kind of blows me away a little bit. So I hope I can live up to that. I want to thank Ryan for that introduction, but also Raymond Hain, Pam Belcher, Liz Glidden, and Mark Pedretti from the Humanities Forum, along with Anthony Jensen and Amy Almeida from the Philosophy Department for inviting me to be here today and making it possible for me to spend some time with you. I also want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional tribal lands of the Narragansett, and just wanted to recognize that. I also understand that these talks usually happen on Friday. Ryan mentioned to me that this one was going to come on Thursday because this is homecoming weekend. It's really kind of appropriate for several reasons. The first of which is that for me, this is a homecoming, another kind of homecoming. I was born just a few minutes drive from here in what used to be called Lying In Hospital 58 years ago. And most of my family on both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, are from the greater Providence area, especially if you stretch the boundaries of greater down to New Bedford and Warwick. Two of my maternal great-grandparents, Jose Rodriguez Casquillo and Ana Rodriguez Casquillo, emigrated to Providence from the Azores when they were teenagers in 1906. Jose went on to work as a bricklayer for Narragansett Electric Company for his entire career, 40 years. And starting in 1912 with the building of the old coal-fired power plant, which is on South and Eddy Street, now houses the Brown University Administrative Offices and the Rhode Island Nursing Education Center. A third maternal great-grandparent, Nathan Lewis Burgess, was born in New Bedford. His family had come to this side of the Atlantic in 1637 from England, settling in Sandwich on the Cape. He was a whaler and a Navy sailor, and trading in his sea legs went on to manage the Waldorf Luncheonette on Westminster Street. After he married his wife, whom he met, family legend has it, in the old stocking factory at the end of Point Street Bridge. That would have been the George E. Boyden and Sons stocking manufacturer, makers of seamless hosiery, as well as fabrics in cashmere and worsted. Try to say that 3 times fast. Although there is no record that he worked there, only his wife Ruth. The 1910 Rhode Island Census lists Nathan Burgess as living as a boarder with Mr. and Mrs. John T. Irving at 39 Point Street, Fox Point. And his occupation is given as gas fitter with the Providence Gas Company. So he may have been doing some work there when he met his wife. Apparently it was love at first sight, according to my grandmother. At least love at first sight from his side, not so much from hers, but they worked it out. On my father's side, his Irish and Scottish grandparents settled in Providence in the 1890s. So my roots are deep here, and although we later moved up US Route 1 to Foxborough and Plainville, and then into upstate New York, some of my fondest memories from my formative years are from growing up in East Providence, the area around what used to be White Rock Farm, and is now known as the Kent Heights neighborhood. There I was raised in part by Gladys Taylor, who I often say helped make me the man I am today. She provided me a kind of all I really needed to know I learned in kindergarten education. She really took me under her wing, taught me about nature, took me out into the woods of the Kent property, and all sorts of experiments, made me match oak leaves to acorns and describe the trees that I saw and the birds that I saw and heard, and really grounded me in nature and really gave me a foundation for that. She also turned me on to poetry at a very young age. She used to recite in her living room. She had this incredible ability to just conjure any poet. She was Robert Burns or Elizabeth Barrett Browning or what have you. She would just recite them in the living room. It made poetry very exciting, actually, to hear it in that form. She embodied it, really. And also art. She had a big portfolio of the master works of art. It's actually a book that I've been looking for a long time. It has a folio in the back. I still haven't found a copy of it, but I have a friend who has one. I keep trying to negotiate with her on that. But, she encouraged my interest in sports and physical activity. I played hockey and lacrosse, and also baseball for a little bit. And so she was a retired school teacher at the time that I was her protege, for lack of a better term. She was also among the first graduating classes of the Women's College at Brown, later called Pembroke College. And I've written a poem about her, which is also about me, but really about her education of me. It's called The Postlude, or How I Became a Poet. It's too long to share here in its entirety, but let me quote from the ending, which is relevant to my talk today. Gladys always found a caterpillar on the milkweed leaves, tiger stripes of black, white, and yellow. Monarchs, she said, the most beautiful butterfly you'll ever see. I looked incredulously at the caterpillar, believing, because it was Gladys, but not believing her, that this wiggly worm-like thing could be a butterfly. Later, she found a chrysalis and took the leaf and twig from which it hung. She placed it atop a jar on the picnic table. And each day we waited. Waited for what? I didn't know. Until one day it was empty, a hollow blue-green emerald shell, and I almost cried. Look out in the meadow, she instructed. Hundreds, it seemed like thousands, of monarch butterflies flitting about from flower to flower. The woolly bear was easier to study. We put it in a jar with a twig and a fresh grass every day. It curled and slept and ate until one day it climbed and climbed to the top and spun a cocoon from its own hairs. There it stayed for weeks until I thought it must be dead. But then, emerging from its silky capsule, a hideous sight, gray, tawny, dull, a tiger moth, nothing like the cute and fuzzy reddish brown and black teddy bear we'd found. This is magic, said Gladys, nature's magic. And I believed her. I believe her still, that there's some magic in nature speaking within us when we are in it, of it, let it in. Science may explain this all away, physics or biology, but nothing will shake my faith in this, that the force of nature, the inner fire, anima mundi, Gaia, or whatever you may call it, is alive within each being and everything with which we share this earth. My Mother Earth was Gladys Taylor, and she taught me these things and about poetry and art in the few brief years we had together. Gladys taught me how to look at the world, to pay attention. Thus began my education from nature's bosom, a woman, childless herself, who, in her dungarees and work shirt, took a child under her wing and gave him gold, gave him his desire for dwelling on this earth. And finally, I have a fondness for Providence College, because as a sports-mad kid growing up in this area, I was a fan of North Providence's own Ernie De Gregorio, PC class of '73. How many of you know who Ernie D is? A couple of you? Okay. Well, when I was a kid, in his last year, at senior year, he and Marvin Barnes led the Friars to a Final Four appearance in the NCAA tournament, and it was magical. And I spent many, many hours in my driveway trying to mimic his feats. Ernie D from the top of the key. It was, I could still hear myself doing the play-by-play in the driveway. Well, this afternoon, I'm not here to talk about Providence sports legends, although I would be remiss if I neglected to mention my late grandfather, Edward Perry, née Casquillo, son of those Azorean immigrants previously mentioned, who was also born near here and was baptized at the Holy Rosary Church on Fox Point. He was a Providence sports legend in his own right. Two-term president of the Metacomet Country Club, he ran the Rhode Island Golf Association for 33 years. He was one of the founders of the Northeast Amateur Invitational in 1962 and was inducted into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame in 1982. He was also the only administrator among the charter members of the Rhode Island Golf Hall of Fame in 2001, 7 years after his passing. In 1971, he received the Frank Lanning Award for the most outstanding contribution to sports in Rhode Island. Incidentally, I note that the late Mr. Lanning received an honorary degree from your esteemed institution. So there's the connection. Let me hereby dedicate my talk to my grandfather's memory. So this afternoon, I want to talk to you and read a few of my poems and short essay excerpts from this book, Dwelling. And I should mention that the images that you're seeing, they'll scroll every couple of minutes, are by Hans van Meuven, who is a wonderful artist and friend of mine. We were at a artist colony together, and I commissioned him to use these drawings in the book, also the cover image. So I've been meeting with Ryan and his students, and they've been graciously going through my book, Dwelling, an Ecopoem, and I've been here to shed some light on what oblique scholarship may be found in those pages. It's a mix of poetry and prose divided into 3 parts, a sequence of poems, a series of thematically linked essay questions, and another sequence of poems exploring the etymology of the verb to dwell, which appear, as a poet friend said to me, like a whisper along the bottom of the page. The lofty 4-part, or 4-fold, as Heidegger might have it, subtitle of my talk, Dwelling, Nature, Phenomenology, and Ecopoetry, implies that the interrelationship between these 4 concepts, which I intend to explore with you. And in doing so, I will cover 3 areas, which may or may not match another German philosopher's dialectical approach, my thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, if you will, which I hope, considering there will probably be a few more parentheses, will not lead to paralysis either for you or me. We shall see. So first, my thesis. Home as a concept as much as a place. It was recently pointed out to me by a fellow writer who has lately become very familiar with my work. She was doing an interview with me and read several of my books before that a consistent theme in my poetry and prose is the search for home. Place and home are indeed very important to me, and as we will see, the writing and reflections I will share may bear out her observation. But let me first talk a bit about Heidegger. To be honest, like many of my generation, I first heard the name Heidegger as a teenager in a song by the comedy troupe Monty Python, the Bruce's Philosopher's Song. For those of you who don't know the song, the Pythons run through a mini history of philosophy and philosophers and their prowess as drinkers more than thinkers. The line about Heidegger goes, Heidegger, Heidegger was a boozy beggar who could drink you under the table. It made an impression. Years later, I read through the work of several philosophers celebrated by the Pythons, including Heidegger, searching, if not for home, then for what poet Elizabeth Bishop called a miserable philosophy to call my own. He didn't seem very boozy to me. Incidentally, the German philosopher whose dialectics I attempt to emulate here, Hegel, was outconsumed by David Hume in the Python's pithy little ditty. I first read Heidegger's Building Dwelling Thinking in the mid-1980s when I picked up a used copy of Poetry, Language, Thought, which I thought was a great title, totally relevant to me at the time, in which Albert Hofstadter had translated several of the philosopher's essays. I took it with me to Germany when I moved there in the late 1986, hoping it would help me understand some of the philosophy of the country to which I was moving. I lived in central Germany and in Paris for the next year, reading German poetry and trying to write a book about the French avant-garde artist Marcel Duchamp, which I never finished. But that's a story for another time. My copy of Heidegger's book was an old paperback from the mid-70s, which you could tell from the typeface and cover illustration. Heidegger in pixelated black and white profile, as if produced by a dot matrix printer, against an almost Escher-like style design consisting of multicolored strands of sea, or what might be macaroni, albeit macaroni in various shades of green and blue, which the book designer Randall Richman, who was the house designer at Harper & Row back in the day, must have intended to represent a stained glass window. Anyway, I digress. I suppose what attracted me to Heidegger was his engagement with art, poetry, and ideas. This was the first collection of his writing that I delved into. His thinking about art and poetry, building and the environment, and their relationship to, well, thinking. The book, and particularly that essay, didn't offer me a lot of insights in terms of understanding the post-war German psyche or the world in which I found myself. A trip to what was then East Berlin offered me more in that regard. But it did help inform a deep dive I was undertaking that would ultimately change my poetry and my writing life forever. For me, Heidegger's ideas about the environment and our human separation from nature stayed with me, lingering and percolating over the next 6 years. Sometime later, about 20 years from where we are now, actually, I took up the book again, and specifically this essay, and I started thinking about the root causes of our deep separation from nature. Just as building had been separated from dwelling, in Heidegger's view, so too, we as humans had separated ourselves from nature. This was becoming painfully obvious to me in my then role as a fundraiser and marketer with the Nature Conservancy, the global conservation organization. The Conservancy's primary goal was to protect nature. But protect it from whom? Well, from people, from us, and our penchant for destroying the natural world. As I say in my poem, Healing, we need to save us from ourselves. That line was a direct quote from the late John Bogle, founder of Vanguard, the mutual fund innovator. He said it to me after I introduced myself as being an employee of one of his directors. Our then CEO, John Sawhill, was on the Vanguard board. "Scott, there's one more thing I want to say to you," he said as I walked away. "Save us from ourselves." It was an imperative. Here is the poem in its entirety. Healing, not saving. For healing indicates corrective, reclaiming, restoring the earth. Oh, I should mention that this poem is found in the handouts, the first one. I'll start again. Healing, not saving. For healing indicates corrective, reclaiming, restoring the earth to its bounty, to right placement and meaning. Forward thinking, making things new or better, or at least bringing back from the edge. The way bulbs are nestled in earth, starting to heal again. The way a wound heals. Keep warm. Sun following rain, rain following drought. Perhaps we have come far enough along in this world to start healing. Protecting from harm, from our disjunctive lives. The way the skin repairs with the scab, injury mediated by mindfulness. The bark of the tree of blood heals wounds we cannot see. Deliver us from the time of trial and save us from ourselves. The Nature Conservancy was and still is one of the most successful conservation organizations in the world. I say that not to boast. I no longer work for them. I do support them still. But nevertheless, the destruction of the earth and its ecosystems, rainforests, coral reefs, grasslands, swamps, mangroves, etc., far outpaced our ability to keep up, to protect and preserve, to fulfill our mission. I'd been working for the Conservancy for a decade by then and was very proud of our work. But in late 2001, possibly in the wake of 9/11, where the Twin Towers, perhaps the ultimate expression of Heidegger's concept of the rift between building and dwelling, had been destroyed by an act of terror the likes of which we'd never seen. Was the ability of our species to see ourselves as part of nature rather than apart from it the root cause of our destructive tendencies? Did our devaluing of ecosystems and habitats speak to our inability to realize that this planet was and is, in fact, our one and only island home? An island, albeit floating in blue-black space, rather than situated in a sea of blues or greens from that Heidegger paperback. Was our separateness from nature driven by our Judeo-Christian sense of superiority over nature? Although one could argue that sense of superiority, that sense of dominion over nature, was also the origin of our conservation ethic. To be stewards of the earth, was it not? I turned to Heidegger for some answers to these questions, but as is usually my method, I also began to write about it. Like my former teacher, poet Gary Snyder, I don't write to say what I think, I write to find out what I'm thinking. I had started to write a column for an online journal called Green Biz, which had a focus on the environment and business and the nascent sustainability movement. And I later turned that column into a blog called The Green Skeptic, which I wrote for 10 years, and a gig as a commentator with Varney and Company on Fox Business. That's another story for another time. Turning to poetry, as I often do, to further explore my thinking, for me, as I've often said, poetry is the most precise language we have for making sense of our world. Here is my poem, Dwelling. Bridges and factories, supermarkets and box stores, airports and power stations are buildings, not dwellings. Train stations and breweries, office parks and dams, malls, stadiums, and concert halls are built, but are not dwelling places. The truck driver is at home on the interstate or the truck stop, but he seeks no shelter there. The CEO finds comfort in the boardroom, but she does not make her dwelling there. These buildings house human beings. We inhabit them, yet we do not dwell in them. 2. To dwell, to remain, to tarry in a place, learning a place intimately, is a form of dwelling. Thinking about dwelling is being human. I dwell, therefore I am. Dwelling means being part of, not apart from, nature. We are insofar as we dwell. Building as dwelling is habitual. Do we dwell out of habit or because dwelling is what we do? Inhabitants seek home, more than just buildings that are habitable. Dwelling is habitation. 3. We inhabit. We inhabit the earth. We inhabit a habitat. We inhabit a building. We inhabit a dwelling. We are in habit. We do not dwell because we build. We build because we dwell. We dwell because we are dwellers. We are insofar as we dwell. Home inhabits you. I don't know if this was the first poem I wrote in the sequence. There may have been one or two that precede it. I do know that it was among the first that dealt directly with Heidegger's text, updating it, if you will. Not exactly a translation, but a version, as poets like to say. We can heal that rift, Heidegger suggested, by preserving the earth, by not exploiting its resources, by thinking about building as dwelling and our relationship to community. Here's another poem from the sequence, and it should follow dwelling in the handout. It's called Saving. Saving means to snatch from danger, to remove threats and stem loss. Saving means setting aside from things that endanger. Say that saving is more than sparing and preserving. It is caching for the future, forestalling use. To save also means cultivating, setting things free. To save means leaving something to its own devices, preserved for itself alone. Earth is the habit we wear, the provider, provender, grounded in rock and water, fulfilling itself in plants and animals. To be stewards of the earth means to take it under one's care, to look after, to spare and preserve, to protect from harm. My reactions to Heidegger's essay were complicated by several factors, not the least of which was the philosopher's complicity with the Nazis during World War II. But also that some of what Heidegger says about dwelling didn't ring true with what I understood were the origins and meanings of the word dwelling. For example, Heidegger asserted that dwelling is best accomplished solely by staying in place, when in fact I had discovered that the roots of the word imply abandonment, leave-taking, and frankly, wandering. Heidegger concluded his essay with an example of his own dwelling in Germany's Black Forest, also home to the Brothers Grimm, by the way. His Black Forest retreat, known as Die Hut, located in Todtnadberg, embodied his concept of being rooted in place. When I lived in Germany, I went to visit the site. It was a remarkably strenuous hike through a powerful, almost magical landscape in southwestern Germany. The perfect setting for Grimm fairy tales. I never found the hut. I was very disappointed. It was as if its unconcealment, as Heidegger would put it, was ultimately concealed from me. A few years ago, I read a Washington Post article in which Walter Nicklin described his own visit. He found the cabin, and he says it's more a cabin than a hut, and explained why it was so hard to find. It's still in the family, who prefer to keep it private. The poet Paul Celan, who was Jewish, also went to Die Hut to confront Heidegger while he was still alive. This from my question about dwelling and Heidegger, which is not in the handout because it's a longer section of prose, but it's in the book. Celan believed the task of the poet was to unconceal the being of things. Perhaps he sought out the philosopher to unconceal the being of the poet's people as true dwellers, as wanderers. He wanted Heidegger to abandon his former beliefs and at last admit to being a dweller himself. For dwelling he was, that is, in the old Frisian sense of the word dwalin, which means to be in error. While dwelling started from Heidegger's essay, it soon departed from it to explore the nature of our dwelling on earth, what I was really wrestling with at the time. How we conceive of our place and our concept of home. There's also Gaston Bachelard, Kate Soper, Merleau-Ponty, David Abram, Robert Polk Harrison, and Homer's Odyssey in there too. Homer's Odyssey shows up in my work all the time. It haunts me. Which of course brings me back to homecoming. As I mentioned, most of my writing, if I'm honest, seems to be about a search for home. This from the question of the city as an ecosystem. Eco is from the Greek oikos, meaning home, a home system, economy, ecology, functioning in its interconnectedness. Speaking of the city as ecosystem, and this may be my antithesis, nature versus the city is impossible because the city is nature. At the time I wrote this book, I was trying to reconcile myself to making a home in the city of Philadelphia, where I had moved after 2.5 winters working for the Conservancy in Alaska. In Alaska, 2.5 winters is 3 years. Again, a story for another time. Among conservationists, I think I'm kind of unusual in that I'm comfortable in both the country and the city. And returning to the busy East Coast, where all them people are, a long-time Alaskan asked me, perplexed, when I told him I was moving back. He had moved to Alaska from Montana because there were too many people in Montana. In Philadelphia, we lived within the city limits, albeit in a northwestern neighborhood called Chestnut Hill, which was almost a suburb in the city, with Central High Street full of shops, 2 commuter railroad lines, one of the country's largest forested urban parks running right through it, and houses with cozy garden plots. It's a neighborhood often held up as an example of an ideal urban community, and its design has been copied by architects of the new urbanism, which sprang up throughout the US over the past few decades. My oldest son, Jasper, who's 25, recently graduated from Holy Cross, is now living in Boston. We saw him last night. He was born in Alaska. And as I told Ryan's students, I thought that was going to be pretty cool for him. You know, I'm Jasper from Alaska, when he's introducing. He was learning, really, he was about 3 years old when we moved. He was really learning to adjust to life in a city without moose, without bears, and without blueberries. Well, at least not store-bought, other than store-bought blueberries. You couldn't just go up onto the mountainside and pick them. I was determined, however, to give him an education much like Gladys Taylor had given me on the old Kent farm in East Providence. Our garden house was in the shadow of another water tower, not the iconic rusting red and white one that used to stand in EP, for those of you familiar with it and may remember it, before it was replaced, but by an old stone tower, just as iconic. Actually, it looked like something out of the landscape that Heidegger situated in the Black Forest. My plan and approach were perfectly scaled to a young person's size and attention span. Take 1 square yard, 1 plot of land, and focus your attention on it. Get to know its soil. Get to know its biomass, its plants, animals, birds, insects, whatever was found there, whatever comprised it. In this sense, I wasn't alone. Robert Michael Pyle wrote in his book, The Thunder Tree, that people who know conserve. People who don't know don't care. I wanted my son to know, to care, and when the time came, to conserve. This is from the Question of City and Nature. The human beings are of nature. If human beings are of nature and our making is nature brought forth, then our cities are also products of nature. We dwell in cities. We are part of their organized complexity, and therefore our cities are part of our natural environment. If we view cities as constructs that contribute to our alienation from nature, we forget that we, like all other animals, share a reliance on the Earth's environment. If rather we view cities as an extension of ourselves, of our dwelling or being on the Earth, then cities become a part of nature too. Cities become nature because we make them, and we are part of nature. Nature stems from the Latin natura, meaning birth or character. Perhaps nature, then, is just a meme passed from one to another in English since it first showed up in 1662, where it described the material world beyond human civilization or society. Coincidentally, 1662 was the same year that the last dodo bird was sighted. Perhaps we can tend the dwelling of our cities by thinking of building as dwelling and promoting diversity of habitat for both human and non-human species. Thinking about building as dwelling, we can build or rebuild our cities intentionally to be more conducive and inclusive of nature, thus helping make our cities more livable while simultaneously healing our rupture with nature. And now a word about phenomenology. The word comes from the Greek phenomenon, that which appears, and logos, which means study, and has come to mean the philosophical study of the structures of experience and consciousness. As a movement, it was founded early in the last century by Husserl, who I note is curiously absent in the Python's catalog of philosophers, which I imagine, as poet, because it is almost as impossible to find a rhyme for Husserl as it is for orange. Phenomenology, as I understand it, was not so much a unified movement, as researcher Gabriela Farina has explained, but rather a style of thought, a method, an open and ever-renewed experience having different results, which in fact is a good way to describe what I was up to in this book, the method of my madness. Curiously, when I first started to write the poems engaging with this concept, I sent a few early ones to my poet friend Alison Hawthorne Deming, whose words are quoted on the cover. She responded enthusiastically, saying that what I was writing was a phenomenology of how we live on the earth. We ended up using the quote on the front of the book, but when she first wrote that to me, it was daunting. I was driving up to the Malay colony in Austerlitz, New York, where I wrote most of the book during a residency in November 2002, and actually where I met Hans. I kept seeing her words scroll across the windshield over and over, and I had to pull over a few times because it was just so daunting. My heart would race, and I was having trouble breathing. How could I possibly live up to that? But it was also encouraging. You know, sort of like, wow, someone really thinks I can do this. So I leave it up to the reader to determine whether I was successful. And finally, ecopoetry, or my synthesis. The ecopoem should be about relationship. Ecopoetry, as I understood it at the time, began as a reaction to romantic poetry, poetry where epiphanies in nature abound, along with a human-centric worldview. To me, however, much of the early critical thinking around ecopoetry seemed to further drive a wedge between human beings and the non-human, or more than human world, as David Abram called it in The Spell of the Sensuous. As recently as 2016, John Shoptaw, writing in Poetry Magazine, said, an ecopoem needs to be environmental, and it needs to be environmentalist. By environmental, he means, quote, first, that an ecopoem needs to be about the non-human natural world, wholly or partly, in some way or another, but really, and not just figuratively. He also quotes the poet Forrest Gander, who writes in Red Start and Ecological Poetics that he is less interested in nature poetry, where nature features as theme, than in poetry that investigates, both thematically and formally, the relationship between nature and culture, language, and perception. I wanted an eco-poetry that was more inclusive, as Gander's definition implied, that allowed for, as I write in the question of the ecopoem in the book, the terrors and horrors of nature, the terrible things creatures do to each other, parasites and carnivorous plants, poisonous snakes and stink bugs, nature, warts and everything. The ecopoem, well executed, balances polemic with poetic languages, uses prose to explicate ideas, and returns to poetry when the spirit of things needs revealing. Earth, image, word, desire, and love, all combined in one unending story the ecopoem is meant to tell, into a presencing, a bringing forth, and an unconcealing of our dwelling. Above all, the ecopoem should be about relationship, our relationship to each other and our relationship to the earth, our dwelling. I might have added our home. Two significant experiences in 1992, 10 years before I wrote Dwelling, and a pivotal year for me in many respects, brought me to thinking about ecopoetry. In March of that year, I went to work for the Nature Conservancy in its New York Lower Hudson chapter. Like a kid in a candy store, or perhaps more appropriately, an outdoor enthusiast in an Orvis outlet, I found myself interacting with scientists, conservation biologists, and land stewards, and having to synthesize, and in some cases translate, their words and work for a lay audience, i.e. our donors. It also provided me an opportunity to see and learn from some of the most compelling landscapes and natural habitats around the world, from Indonesia to Ecuador, Brazil to Alaska. In all, I worked for the Nature Conservancy for 15 years, a remarkable experience that still informs my writing and way of looking at the world. That summer found me in California at the Art of the Wild conference, organized by the community of writers in the Sierra Nevada, where I studied with a trio of West Coast poets, Robert Hass, Walter Pavlich, and Gary Snyder. Snyder was a hero of mine. His Pulitzer Prize-winning Turtle Island was one of my Bibles as a teenager. And his example as an environmental thinker informed much of my own sensibility about nature and our human relationship with it. At the community of writers, Snyder instructed us to find totems for our poetry. This is the world of nature, myth, archetype, and ecosystem that we must all investigate, he said. Incidentally, mine are ravens and polar bears, although I was at Roger Williams Park this morning, and I went to what was the old seal house, and I had this memory of interacting with a seal there when I was a very little kid, and I started thinking, wow, maybe it should be seals too. What Snyder was sharing with us was captured later in his 1995 book, A Place in Space, as some points for a new nature poetics, which I'll read. That it be literate, that is, nature literate. Know who's who and what's what in the ecosystem, even if this aspect is barely visible in the writing. That it be grounded in a place, thus place literate, informed about local specifics on both ecological biotic and socio-political levels, and informed about history, social history and environmental history, even if this is not obvious in the poem. That it use coyote as a totem, the trickster, always open, shape-shifting, providing the eye of other beings going in and out of death, laughing with the dark side. That it use bear as totem, omnivorous, fearless, without anxiety, steady, generous, contemplative, and relentlessly protective of the wild. That it find further totems. This is the world of nature, myth, archetype, and ecosystem that we must investigate. Depth ecology. That it fear not science, go beyond nature. Go beyond nature literacy into the emergent new territories in science, landscape ecology, conservation biology, charming chaos, complicated systems theory. That it go further with science into awareness of the problematic and contingent aspects of so-called objectivity. That it study mind and language, language as wild system, mind as wild habitat, world as a making, poem, poem as creature of the wild mind. And above all, that it be crafty and get the work done. In October of the year, back in New York, I took a master class with Snyder at the 92nd Street Y. Not quite 29, I still had some of the hubris of my young adulthood. Many of you may be experiencing this yourselves. Snyder said my poems were pretty good if you want to be an 18th century poet, but do you want to be an 18th century poet? I wrote a pissy note to him a few months later saying something to the effect that at least I don't write bear scat on the trail poems. He was right, of course. My poems were too romantic with a capital R, and my syntax had likely been abused by too much time studying German poetry, trying to learn the language, back when I was first reading Heidegger. A few years ago, it horrified me to learn that my note is among his papers housed now at the UC Davis Library. But we saw each other a couple of years ago at a conference at UC Davis, and I believe all is good between us. Knock on wood. It took me almost 10 years to hear what Snyder was saying to me in that master class and to apply it to my writing. When I first set out to the Malay colony, where my residency was generously sponsored by the Concordia Foundation, you will learn to thank the foundations that support you throughout your career, throughout your life. It was to explore poetically the concepts I'd been wrestling with in response to Heidegger's essay, but also in the burgeoning critical theory being developed around ecopoetics. Scholar Bernard Quentenbach wrote that the ecopoet, like the prose nature writer, is a kind of missionary, motivated by a fierce devotion to a subject matter that is endangered and absolutely crucial to the poet's well-being. And, as even the largest circle of the general public, with the exception of some on the Republican side, is increasingly aware, to the world at large. One additional aside before I conclude. At a conference of writers and conservation practitioners in 1999 held by the Azorean Society, I heard Barry Lopez, phenomenal writer. If you have not read his National Book Award-winning Arctic Dreams, you really must read it, bemoan the fact that he felt marginalized as a nature writer. After his talk, I went up to him and I said, Barry, if you want to feel marginalized, you should try being a nature poet. You win, he replied. John Elder, author of Imagining the Earth, Poetry and the Vision of Nature, posits that poetry derives from the living earth as surely as our human bodies and minds do. The health and beauty of culture are ultimately inseparable from those of nature, and that poetry itself can manifest the intricate, adaptive, and evolving balance of an ecosystem. Ecopoetry, then, was starting to expand my way of looking at the world, and combined with my work at the Conservancy, informed my poetry in ways that created a kind of method for bridging my thinking between dwelling and nature, phenomenology and ecopoetry, and consequently, my thinking about home. Ultimately, as I wrote in the essay question that closes dwelling, dwelling is the being of home, its presence and its essence. As such, it haunts us. Hanter in Old French, or hanten in Middle English, to haunt. Home, or the idea of home, haunts us, especially if, like Odysseus, we are always searching for it, for the way back home. All we can do is try to make it, try to bring forth home as dwelling. Perhaps all this thinking about dwelling, about the being, existence, or essence of home, will only succeed in planting seeds for thinking about how we live on the earth. Enough will have been gained if dwelling, as Heidegger wrote, has become worthy of questioning and thus has remained worthy of thought. Now, I've spent the better part of an hour talking about dwelling and home, but I have a confession to make. Is there anybody here who can help me with that? Probably on campus somewhere. Despite searching for home, that's the last Catholic joke I'll make, okay? Despite searching for home most of my life, I never really felt at home until recently, when two things happened. The first, in 2014, when my wife Samantha and I were married and blended our two families, she's sitting right here, blended our two families into what many have observed as a contemporary Brady Bunch, 3 boys and 3 girls. All we're missing is Alice, and sometimes we could really use Alice. Because we now had this big blended family, we needed a house to fit all of us in, and soon after, our dog Beverly. When we first walked into our house in Ditmas Park, Brooklyn, I knew it was home. When we put a bid in on the house, but we were worried we wouldn't get it, Samantha's youngest, Sasha, said, "Maybe if we dream together, we'll get it." And so was born Dream Together House, where we lived for the past 7 years. As Gaston Bachelard wrote, there exists for each one of us an oniric house, a house of dream memory that is lost in the shadow beyond the real past. The other time that I truly felt at home was in 2018, when I first landed on San Miguel Island in the Azores. The island my great-grandparents had left over 100 years before, where I participated in Disquiet International's Azores residency. It was strange. When I exited the plane and walked across the tarmac to the terminal, I felt like I'd been there before. At first, I dismissed it. It must remind me of other islands I've landed on through my conservation work over the years, the Caribbean or South America or the Asia Pacific. But it was more than that. It was visceral. Resonance felt deep inside me, inside my body. My body responded to the place. I could feel its presence within me, if that makes sense. Of course, I had been there before. It was in my DNA. We've been back a few times since, as recently as January 2020, and hope to be there for Christmas this year. Ultimately, I think we're going to divide our time between the Azores and here, for Samantha has also fallen for this island archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic, and our connections to it deepen every day. My sense of myself is growing, emerging. I write in my book-length poem, Azorean Suite, published in the Azores last year. The more I connect with this island and my heritage here, how did I live so long without this connection, without the connections to family and friends I've made here? 56 years without it, but now I can't let go. My roots grow deeper with each visit. My longing digs into my heart each time I leave. My own saudades de terra, gripping my heart and soul, as if fate, too, has grabbed a hold and opened up my heart to a home I never knew I had. It sounds sentimental, I know, and I'm usually more cynical, or at least skeptical, but it does feel like home, and there's no use resisting this island's siren's call. I'm no Odysseus. Do we carry home within, I ask in dwelling? Yes, I believe we do. Home inhabits us. At last, I've come home. Thank you.
thank you very much. So we have about 15, 17 minutes for questions. Standard, we really like to begin with a student question. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over to you. Student question. Oh, as far away as you possibly could. Well, no, I'll come to you. You stay put.
Okay. This actually goes back to the last thing that you said. You had said that, paraphrasing, how did I live so long without this connection? And that's something that I wanted to ask you because something that I'm currently a sophomore, something that I had worked on and sort of thought of as part of a concentration in my senior year of high school was the concept, or well, the idea of lacking versus loss. When you lose something versus when you're lacking something. For example, an individual who grew up without a certain parent ever around versus an individual who got to know that parent, got to have those experiences, and then experiences loss. And so I just wanted to really get your opinion and your viewpoint on what was it like to sort of have that lacking, but then once you know it, once you understand like how it completes a part of you, you can't imagine losing it. And even in imagining losing it, you can sense how much pain that would be. And do you think that if you ever had to lose it, would you have wanted to know it, or would you have wanted to never know it? So, loaded question.
That's a very powerful question and an awesome question. It's, yeah, no, I've thought about this a lot because I really didn't know about this part of my heritage for most of my life. I mean, I knew vaguely. My grandfather's family came from Portugal, you know, the Azores. I didn't even know where that was, you know, when I was a kid. He was born in this country in 1915, wanted to be an American. And so he went by the name Ed Perry and did not associate with the Portuguese community, did not engage in, you know, the festas and all of the food and the, you know, culture, really distanced himself from it. Was a very successful person as a result. I think he made a choice for himself. But what that did is cascaded down. My mother had no connection to the community. She never learned the language. And consequently, I didn't either. And so for most of my life, you know, I think part of what in this search for home was not so much a home as a place, but a missing piece, you know, in me. And so that was, yeah, it's that lack, you know, I hadn't lost it in a way because it was just hidden from me. You know, it was concealed, and I had to find it. And it's been a long journey. I first tried to find it by confronting my grandfather. I spoke Portuguese to him, which nobody ever did. He only spoke with his parents, and he was kind of shocked, taken aback. And I thought I had him. I thought I'm going to get the story, and then he died. So the stories went with him, and I still was back to square one. I don't have anything. And then I went to his sister, and before she died, and my mother said, "Don't believe anything Aunt Alice tells you. She's completely crazy, and she's, you know." And so I thought, okay, well, this is totally an unreliable source here. I don't know where am I going to get this? How am I going to get it? I don't know why I didn't realize, I guess, that I could have just got on an airplane and gone to the Azores like years ago. But, you know, you get busy and you do other things, and I was traveling a lot, so it was hard for me to traveling a lot for work, so it was hard for me to take a side trip, you know, to explore. But, yeah, I think it was a profound lack, something that was really missing within me that I was seeking. And I was looking for it, didn't know where to find it, until I found it's not just the place, the culture and the engagement that I've had, and I'm going to point out that my padrino, my godfather, if you will, is sitting here, Onesimo Almeida, visiting us from Brown University. Thank you. And the embrace that I've experienced, it's almost like I'm coming home, like the lost son, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess kind of a follow-up question on that. So when you first really realized and accepted that you were missing something. I think, did you see how other people sort of interacted with sort of like who they are, their culture, like where they originally came from? Do you think that you would have become aware of that lacking on your own if you had not seen other people experience the same thing? Like, do you think you would have just known that something wasn't complete?
I definitely knew that something wasn't complete. I felt the absence. I felt the missing piece. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to fill it. I tried a lot of different things to try to fill it. Just they turned out to be distractions more than anything else, and didn't fulfill me. And I think that really, and I'm writing a book about this now actually, so I may want to talk to you about your research. That I think that finding it. You know, my first reaction when I found it was sort of like, well, wait a minute, it's not me. I mean, I didn't grow up with this. I don't have any, you know. My wife was to introduce us. Oh yeah, my husband's Azorean. I was like, I don't say I'm Azorean. I'm not Azorean. I wasn't born there. I didn't grow up with the culture. I can't claim it. Like I don't deserve it, you know. And yet, I feel like there's certain aspects of the culture that feel really deeply ingrained, and that's why I referenced the DNA, because I felt like, yeah, how could I possibly feel like I've been here before? And I started thinking about, you know, some of the research going on in intergenerational trauma and the markers on RNA and that are passed on. So it's basically the RNA is basically for those science, probably I'll butcher this, so you can correct me after. They're basically like, these markers are storytellers. They tell the DNA what to do when, and you know, they're indicators. And I really feel like going back, I've researched and traced my family roots in Portugal to 1402, so I know that far back. And there are several Sephardic names in the family tree. And so, you know, the trauma that they experienced having to give up their religion and convert, the trauma of the generation that went from the mainland to colonized the islands in 1450s. Some of my family were among the first colonists. And like, what did they experience? They were from the interior, north central and south central parts of Portugal, had never seen the ocean before, and yet they're being packed into a boat, sent out to this island where you have to like make a living and figure out how to, you know, tame this wild, you know, place that was unpopulated by anybody before. I mean, yeah, I think about the trauma associated with that. And then when my great-grandparents left, my great-grandmother was 14, and she left with her whole family. So at least she had that. My great-grandfather had just turned 19 and came on his own. So, and these were island people who had never, as far as I know, had never been in boats. You know, they weren't fishermen. They lived in sort of this interior of San Miguel Island. And so what was that like? I mean, it must have been incredibly traumatic, you know, leave your family and go to this place, this totally unknown world, you know. And then my grandfather sequestering his Portugueseness and his Azoreanness, and like, you know, what kind of trauma did that leave him? Why was he so ashamed of it? And frankly, I you know, when I was a kid, because I got very dark in the summer and tanned very quickly, you know, I was constantly teased and constantly picked on, and people, you know, mostly they thought I was Italian because they didn't really make that association, but there was a certain amount of shame associated with, at that time, with being Portuguese. And so that definitely left markers on me and probably concealed some of that, the hole that was there, you know. It took me a long time to get over that. So I don't know if I touched on all the points there, but okay.
Yeah, good. That's your follow-up too reminded me of the poet Leah Purpura will often make these little lists of words that she thinks needs to exist. And one of them was nostalgia for something you've never experienced. What's that? Sorry, I interloped there. Other questions?
Doesn't have to be a student now.
No, it's open to everybody.
So I have a quick question about the illustrations of the book.
Yeah.
So when you were commissioning the illustrator to create these drawings, did you give him like some ideas that you were attempting to convey, or did you kind of leave him to his own devices?
No, he actually, these all existed.
Oh, okay.
And I asked, I originally had a different idea for the cover image. There was a sculpture that he had created that I wanted to use, and but my publisher wasn't really interested in that. And she said, well, I said, I really would like to use Hans's work because we were both at this residency together. I said, what about some illustrations? And so we came up with first with the cover image, which when I sent it to her, she was like, yeah, I mean, this is the cover of this book. It's like, you gotta be, the rootedness through the house and the structure, the whole thing. And so, and she said, well, does he have more drawings? And I said, yeah. So I told him what I was using it for, and he remembered it from our time there. So he sent me a whole catalog of them, and there's just coincidentally that they were such a perfect fit for this and had some of the themes and some of, this is obviously like the city and, it was really, it was serendipity, so. Thank you for your question.
Other questions? Hand up.
Oh, come on. There you go. Yeah, see?
3 simultaneously. So we'll go back. We'll do you and then you and then you.
So thank you for coming today. I really enjoyed the part of your talk when you were talking about instilling the values of caring about the conservation of nature into your son. And it just got me thinking about, you said something along the lines of people who don't know, don't care. And you have a really interesting perspective because you've worked in the conservation industry and you're also a poet who, you have these really deep subjective experiences with nature as well. So I'm wondering from your perspective, do you think, how would you say the general sentiment towards nature is? Like, would you say it's apathy that, or like an indifference or just a general ignorance of what we're doing to nature that keeps people like that? And one final thing, what do you think the role of the humanities and art and poetry is in possibly reconciling whatever that is?
Excellent questions, excellent questions. Yeah, I mean, I really hope that it's not just our nature to destroy and despoil our nest, our only home. I mean, at some point we have to really wake up and realize that we don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, I know Jeff Bezos and these Richard Branson or whatever, they're talking about colonizing Mars, but there's no water on Mars. So where are we going to get the water, like to colonize Mars? I mean, that's not going to work. I mean, even Amazon delivery is great, their logistics, but they're not going to be able to get all the water but maybe it's just Jeff Bezos and his family are going to be there, so that might be another issue. But no, I mean, I do think that there's a little bit of apathy, mostly related, because of the messages we get from marketing and from, the world at large. Our whole economy is, as we've seen, is based on consumption. Buy this, buy that, spend your money on this, and everybody has to work and work and work so that they can spend money to fulfill somebody else's pockets, and you've got to have a new thing all the time, a new iPhone every 6 months or whatever, and it's out of control. But those are the messages we get all the time. So if that's the message we hear all the time, we're not getting any messages, or they're not filtering through because there's so much noise, that, no, wait a minute. We need to be more careful about the world. Every once in a while, you'll see, like, Greta Thunberg will be on TV or something like that, and be like, oh, yeah, I totally agree with her, but nobody does anything about it. And she keeps saying, she goes in front of these, international bodies. She's an amazing person. I mean, just incredible. If everybody in this room could become like Greta Thunberg, we could probably solve this thing. But she's one voice, and it's really hard because the competition is just so great for the mind share. And I think that we've really separated ourselves culturally and intellectually from nature. We forget that we're animals. We're just like every other mammal. We're in the same, you know. So I don't know if that. I really hope that we can do something about that. I've been working on this for so long, and I've had this concern for all of my life. I mean, Gladys was one of the tools that she used to teach me was a book called The Handbook of Nature Study by I'm going to forget her name at the moment, but anyway, Comstock was her last name. Anyway, she used to use this book, which was sort of a primer for like how to teach people nature. And there was a big movement in the early part of the 20th century up until the 20s or 30s that was where this book was used, and there was a whole nature study movement. And I think getting that generation really to understand it started the consciousness, the awareness that started to happen in the 60s. And so, but then it became, you know, I remember the first Earth Day. I was in school, and we had little ecology pins and, you know, what have you. But it quickly became kind of commercial. And it was no longer, you know, people weren't paying attention, you know. And then some laws were passed that were really good in the 70s, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, by Republican leadership, which was amazing. And now when you think about it, you know, suddenly it's a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue anymore. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the first conservationists in America. He was a Republican. And so it's become a political issue. So you've got the consumer culture on one end. You've got this politicization of it. You can't be for it if you think this way, you know, or I guess that's this way, for you or this way. But anyway, I think, yeah, but this year and every year, the storms get fiercer and the wildfires get greater, and it's really becoming dire, you know. It's hard for me, having worked on this issue for a long time, to think, how did we not make progress? We just doesn't seem like we have, you know? So I try not to be disheartened about it, and when I see people like Greta Thunberg or others, or many others who are working on this, their voices don't get heard as much as they should. But I'm encouraged by that. But the clock is ticking, and we don't have much more time, you know? So I don't know if that completely gets at your question, but if there's...
what do you think do you think that like art and poetry can reconcile?
Oh, absolutely. Art is totally necessary. And it's totally, I think there's a growing movement. Now, I mean, I know that a lot of people say, well, you know, you shouldn't be, if you're political with your poetry, or activist with your poetry, or your painting or whatever, it's not going to resonate. Well, I'm sorry, but that argument doesn't hold any water anymore. We gotta, like, if you're an artist and you care about the world, speak it, tell it, paint it, make movies about it, you know, make theater about it. There's a whole movement now around climate change theater, and people who are telling these stories. They need to be told what's going on, who is being affected by it, how all of us are being affected by it. All walks of life. So we can't escape it. We're all in the same boat.
Thank you.
We'll do just one more question. Who's going to battle out who gets it?
Flip a coin.
Well, you're right in front of me. And, so just a reminder, right after we finish up, there's a reception right across the hallway, free food. You can continue the conversation. If you're one of my students, don't forget to sign in. And don't forget, in the back of your handout, there's a list of all of Scott's works, links to stuff. So if you're interested, he's got it all up on your handout.
Thank you for your wonderful talk and your incredible work. I write about literature and architecture in relation to phenomenology. And my question was about what Merleau-Ponty says in his recently translated into English course notes. He says that literature is an apparatus, that it's that which makes us see. And I'm always interested in the relationship between building, dwelling, and language itself. So I wondered for you if you think that language is that which makes us build, if it's that which makes us dwell, or how do you think about language and building together?
Yeah, I mean, I do touch on this in the book a little bit, but I won't. I'll just give my current thinking about it. I do think that, at a certain point, language sort of was a contributor to distancing ourselves from nature and from dwelling. When you there's a line in Dwelling that is now on a stone in the library in Salt Lake City, which is pretty amazing. But it says, when you think of the word nature, what do you see? And that's sort of the way our relationship with language is it sets it apart in a way. It distances us. But I think that increasingly the way we use language is distorting the way we interact with the rest of the world. So again, back to the marketing and the sort of lingo and all of the commercialization that we have, language is getting in the way. Now I think it's the role of poets and artists and writers and others who use language to try to break that barrier and get it back to something that will engage with and change the way we see through that language. I don't know if that's close to what I haven't read the course notes for.
All right. Well, let's thank Scott one last time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And reception right across the hall.